21. The France of Louis XIV, 1643 to 1715. The triumph of absolutism. French culture in the 17th century. Having traveled in the outer orbits of the 17th century European political system, we come now to its radiant and mighty center, the domain of the Sun King himself, the France against which the rest of Europe felt obliged to combine because its power threatened the interests of so many other countries. The future of the Spanish possessions, the independence of Holland, the maintenance in England of the parliamentary revolution. The France of Louis XIV owed much of its ascendancy to the quantity and quality of its people. Population was stabilized or possibly even falling in the 17th century, the last century in which France was seriously disturbed by famines and peasant rebellions. With 19 million inhabitants in 1700, France was still over 3 times as populous as England and twice as populous as Spain. Its fertile soil in an agricultural age made it a wealthy country, though the wealth was very unevenly distributed. France was big enough to harbor many contradictions. Millions of its people lived in poverty, yet the number in comfortable or even luxurious circumstances was very large. There were both modest country nobles and cosmopolitan grand seigneurs. The middle class included an inordinate number of lawyers, office holders, and bureaucrats. The country was less commercial than Holland or England, yet in sheer numbers, there may have been more merchants in France than in either of the other two countries. Protestants were a declining minority, yet in the mid-17th century, there were still more French Huguenots than Dutch Calvinists. It was a self-sufficient country. Yet the French in this century began trading in India and Madagascar, founded colonial settlements in Canada, explored the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley, set up sugar plantations in the West Indies, expanded their ancient 356 commerce with the Levant, enlarged their mercantile marine, and for a time had the leading navy of Europe. France, in short, became a highly active participant in the widening networks of global trade and European colonization. The contradictions of French society 181. The dominance of France meant the dominance merely of political or military power, but of a people whom most Europeans viewed as the forefront of 17th century art, literature, and social etiquette. They carried over the earlier versatility of the Italian Renaissance. In Nicolas Poussin and Claude Lorraine, they produced a noticeable school of painters. Their architecture was emulated throughout Europe, and they excelled in military fortification and engineering. Much of their literature, though often written by bourgeois writers, was designed for an aristocratic and courtly audience, which had put aside the uncouth manners of an earlier day and prided itself on the refinement of its tastes and perceptions. Corneille and Racine wrote austere tragedies on the personal conflicts and social relations of human life. Molière, in his comedies, ridiculed bumbling doctors, religious hypocrites, new rich bourgeois, and foppish aristocrats. La Fontaine gave the world his animal fables, and La Rochefoucauld, in his witty and sardonic maxims, offered a nobleman's candid judgment on human nature. In Descartes, the French produced a great mathematician and scientific thinker. In Pascal, they found a scientist who was also a profound spokesman for Christianity. And in Bayle, they brought forward an intellectual advocate of early modern skepticism. It was French thought and the French language, not merely the armies of Louis XIV, which in the 17th century were sweeping the European world. Louis XIV understood that France's dominant position in Europe required more than large armies, and that a flourishing cultural life greatly enhanced the international prestige of even the wealthiest or most powerful sovereign state. He therefore gave generous financial 3-5, 7-1, and 8-2 support to his favorite writers and artists, especially those who produced works for his new palace at Versailles. He also brought the arts and sciences into the state's administrative system by establishing royal academies in which various theorists taught the correct principles for art, literature, music, dance, and scientific knowledge. The favored or official aesthetic theory in these academies was called classicism, a theory that emphasized order, harmony, and the artistic achievements of antiquity. Following the example of painters such as Poussin, young artists learned to portray scenes from classical Roman history or mythology with harmonious and almost geometric precision. The great literary theorist of the day, Nicolas Boileau, urged writers to emulate the poetic works of ancient writers who had shown how literature addresses the timeless themes of human knowledge and transcendent truths, rather than the frivolities of daily life. The classicism of French artists and writers thus fit comfortably with the Sun King's appreciation for order and hierarchy in every sphere of social, political, and cultural life. Patronage of the arts by Louis XIV, 358, the French playwright Molière often performed in his own plays, including some that were staged at the court of Louis XIV. He is portrayed here as a character in The School for Wives, a popular comedy about conflicts and deceptions in the relations between women and men. Bridgman Girardon, Art Resource, NY. Yet neither the king nor his official academies could control all of France's artistic and intellectual activity. Some literary critics, soon known as the moderns, began to argue that modern literature and knowledge had in fact surpassed the achievements of ancient cultures, and that Boileau's academic writers, soon called the ancients, deferred much too rigidly to ancient authorities. Meanwhile, other centers of intellectual life emerged outside the royal academies in the new salons of Paris. Developing rapidly in the second half of the 17th century, the salons became the unofficial gathering places for Parisian nobles, wealthy professional persons, and creative writers or artists. They were organized by upper-class women who invited people into their homes to discuss philosophy, literature, and art, all of which could be debated without the formal constraints and solemnity of the academies. The salons attracted criticism and even ridicule from some people in the government and academies, partly because they were created by energetic women, and partly because they flourished outside the official cultural institutions of the state. But the Parisian salons, like the royal academies, became an enduring, distinctive institution in French cultural life. They also welcomed distinguished foreign visitors, thus contributing to the spread of French ideas and social mores throughout Europe. Parisian-style salons eventually appeared in other European cities, along with French fashion, French manners, and the French language. Salons. The development of absolutism in France. 359. This ascendancy of French culture went along with a regime in which political liberties were at a discount. The culture embellished what historians have often called the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV, though the king's power was never as far-reaching as the term absolutism suggests. The Sun King had to secure the cooperation of the nobility and other social classes, and his power was constrained in various ways by regional institutions, French legal traditions, and a fragmented system of local economies. Like other European countries, France had a tradition of political rights and liberties that were associated with older, even feudal, political and legal institutions. It had an Estates General, which had not met since 1615, but was not legally abolished. In some regions, provincial estates, still meeting frequently, retained a measure of self-government and of power over taxation. There were about a dozen bodies known as parliaments, which, unlike the English Parliament, Einheini III had developed as courts of law, each being the supreme court for a certain area of the country. The parliaments upheld certain fundamental laws that they said the king could not overstep, and they often refused to enforce royal edicts that they declared to be unconstitutional. France, beneath the surface, was almost as diverse as Germany. See map, P191. French towns had won charters of acknowledged rights, and many of the great provinces enjoyed liberties written into old agreements with the crown. These local liberties created institutional complications for a would-be absolute monarch. There were some 300 customs or regional systems of law. It was observed that travelers sometimes changed laws more often than they changed horses. Internal tariffs ran along the old provincial borders. Tolls were levied by manorial lords. The king's taxes fell less heavily on some regions than on others. Neither coinage nor weights and measures were uniform throughout the country. France was a bundle of territories held together by allegiance to the same king. The parliaments. 360. This older kind of feudal freedom discredited itself in France at the very time when in Germany a neo-feudal localism was pulling the Holy Roman Empire to pieces. and when in England the older feudal liberties were making a transition to a more modern form of political liberty, embodied in the parliamentary system of an aristocratic state. In France, the old medieval or local type of liberty became associated with disorder. It has already been related how after the disorders of the 16th century religious wars, people had turned with relief to the monarchy, and how Henry IV and then Richelieu had begun to make the monarchy strong. The troubles of the Fronde, beginning in 1648, provided additional incentive for the centralization of political power in France. The Fronde broke out immediately after the Peace of Westphalia, while Louis XIII was still a child and was directed against Cardinal Mazarin, who was governing in his name. It was an abortive revolution, led by the same elements, the parliaments and the nobility, which were to initiate the Great French Revolution in 1789. The parliaments, especially the Parliament of Paris, insisted in 1648 on their right to pronounce certain royal edicts unconstitutional. Barricades were thrown up and street fighting broke out in Paris. The nobility rebelled, as it had often in the past. Leadership was assumed by some prominent noblemen who had enough wealth and influence to believe that, if the king's power were contained, they might govern the country themselves. The rebelling nobles demanded a calling of the Estates General, expecting to dominate over the bourgeoisie and the clergy in that body. Armed bands of soldiers, unemployed since the Peace of Westphalia, and led by nobles, roamed about the country, terrorizing the peasants. If these nobles had expanded their power, the manorial system would likely have fallen on the peasants more heavily, as in Eastern Europe, where triumphant lords were at this very time exacting increased labor services from the peasants. Finally, the rebellious nobles called in Spanish troops to bolster their uprising, though France was still at war with Spain. By this time, the bourgeoisie, together with the parliaments, had withdrawn support from the rebellious nobles. The agitation subsided in total failure. Urban commercial groups could not work together with an assertive nobility. The nobles outraged people throughout France by bringing Spanish soldiers into their rebellion, and 361 the Frondeurs, especially after the parliaments deserted them, had no base of popular support and no systematic or constructive program, aiming only at the overthrow of the unpopular Cardinal Mazarin and at obtaining offices and favors for themselves. The Fronde. After the Fronde, as after the religious wars, the townspeople and peasantry of France, to protect themselves against the claims of the aristocracy, were in a mood to in 1884 welcome the exercise of strong power by the kings. And in the young Louis XIV, they had a man more than willing to grasp all the power he could get. Louis, at age 23, on Mazarin's death in 1661, announced that he would govern the country himself. He was the third king of the Bourbon line. It was the Bourbon tradition, established by Henry IV and by Richelieu, to draw the teeth from independent aristocrats, and this was a tradition that Louis XIV now followed. He was not a man of any transcendent abilities, though he had the capacity, often found among successful executives, of learning a good deal from conversation with experts. His education was somewhat limited, having been made purposely easy, but he had the ability to see and stick to definite lines of policy, and he was extremely methodical and industrious in his daily habits, scrupulously loading himself with administrative business throughout his reign. He was extremely fond of himself and his position of kingship, with an insatiable appetite for admiration and flattery. He loved magnificent display and elaborate etiquette, though to some extent he simply adopted them as instruments of policy rather than as a personal whim. 362 Inspiration of the Epic Poet by Nicolas Poussin, French, 1594 to 1665. Poussin's interest in both the themes and forms of classicism appear in this image of a poet who yearns for the honor of a laurel crown as he meditates on the Greek god Apollo with his lyre and Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. The painting shows the careful symmetry and balance of much 17th century French art. Print collector Getty Images. 185. With the reign of Louis XIV, the state in its modern administrative form took a long step forward. The state in the abstract has always seemed somewhat theoretical to the English-speaking world. Let us say, for simplicity, that the state represents a fusion of justice and power. A sovereign state possesses, within its territory, a monopoly over the administration of justice and the use of force. Private persons neither pass legal judgments on others nor control private armies of their own. For private and unauthorized persons to do so in an orderly state constitutes rebellion. This was in contrast to the older feudal practice by which feudal lords maintained manorial courts and led their own followers into battle. Against these feudal practices, Louis XIV energetically worked, though not with complete success, claiming to possess in his own person, the sovereign ruler, a monopoly over the lawmaking processes and the 363 armed forces of the kingdom. This is the deeper meaning of his reputed boast. L'État, c'est moi. The state is myself. In the France of the 17th century, divided by classes and by regions, there was in fact no practical means of consolidating the powers of state except in a shared deference to one individual. L'État, c'est moi. The state, however, while representing law and order within its borders, has generally stood in a lawless and disorderly relation to other states, because no higher monopoly of law and force has existed. Louis XIV, personifying the French state, had no particular regard for the claims of other states or rulers. He was constantly either at war or preparing for war with his neighbors. The modern state, indeed, was created by the needs of peace at home and war abroad. Machinery of government, as devised by Louis XIV and others, was a means of giving order and security within the territory of the state, and of raising, supporting, and controlling armies for use against other states. The idea that law and force within a country should be monopolized by the lawful king was the essence of the 17th century doctrine of absolutism. Its principal theorist in the time of Louis XIV was the French bishop Jacques Bénigne Bossuet, who advanced the old Christian teaching that all power comes from God and that all who hold power are responsible to God for the way they use it. He held that kings were God's representatives in the political affairs of earth. Royal power, according to Bossuet, was absolute but not arbitrary. The use of power could not be arbitrary because it must be reasonable and just, like the will of God that it reflected, but it was absolute in that it was free from dictation by parliaments, estates, or other subordinate elements within the country. Law, therefore, was the will of the sovereign king, so long as it conformed to the higher law that was the will of God. This doctrine, affirming the divine right of kings, was popularly held in France at the time and was taught in the churches. Absolutism and absolute monarchy became the prevailing concepts of government on 364 much of the European continent in the 17th and 18th centuries. It must be remembered, however, that these terms referred more to legal theories than to facts. A ruler, in theory, could be absolute because he was not legally bound by any other persons or institutions in the country. In reality, he became dependent upon a host of advisors and bureaucrats. He often had to compromise with vested interests, and he could be thwarted by the sheer weight of local custom or meet resistance from lawyers, ecclesiastics, nobles, grandees, hereditary office holders, and miscellaneous dignitaries. And the slow pace of both transportation and communication prevented early modern absolutist rulers from controlling their subjects as quickly or as efficiently as governments have controlled people in modern nation-states. Absolutism 186, Government and Administration. Louis XIV's early and perhaps most important administrative steps assured his tight control of the army. Armed forces in Europe had long been almost a private enterprise. Specialists in fighting, leading their own troops, worked for governments more or less as they chose, either in return for money or to pursue political aims of their own. This was especially common in Central Europe, but even in France, great noblemen had strong private influence over the troops, and in times of disorder, nobles led armed retainers about the country. Colonels were virtually on their own. Provided with a general commission and with funds by some government, they recruited, trained, and equipped their own regiments, and likewise fed and supplied them, often by preying upon civilian populations in the vicinity. In these circumstances, it was often difficult to say on whose side soldiers were fighting. It was hard for governments to set armies into motion, and equally hard to make them stop fighting, for commanders fought for their own interests and on their own momentum. 365 war was not a continuation of policy. It was not an act of the state. It easily degenerated, as in the 30 Years' War, into a kind of aimless and perpetual violence. War, a state activity, Louis XIV made war an activity of state. He compelled all armed persons in France to fight only for him. This produced peace and order within France, while strengthening the fighting power of France against other states. Under the older conditions, there was also little integration among different units and branches of the army. Infantry regiments and cavalry went largely their own way, and the artillery was supplied by civilian technicians under contract. Louis XIV created a stronger unity of control, put the Artillery 187 organically into the army, systematized the military ranks and grades, and clarified the chain of command, placing himself at the top. The government supervised recruiting, required colonels to prove that they were maintaining the proper number of soldiers, and assumed most of the responsibility for equipping, provisioning, clothing, and housing the troops. Higher officers, thus becoming dependent on the government, could be subjected to discipline. The soldiers were put into uniforms, taught to march in step, and housed in barracks. Thus they too became more susceptible to discipline and control. 366 Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud, French, 1659 to 1743. The grandeur of the Sun King is conveyed in this portrait by Rigaud. He uses the king's clothing, stance, and royal emblems to express the power of the French monarchy. Universal Images Group, Getty Images. Armed forces became less of a terror to their own people and a more effective weapon in the hands of the centralizing government. They were employed usually against other governments, but sometimes to suppress rebellion at home. Louis XIV also increased the French army in size, raising it from about 100,000 to about 400,000. These changes, both in size and in degree of government control, were made possible by the growth of a large civilian administration, the heads of which were also civilians under the control of Louis XIV. They were in effect the first ministers of war, and their assistants, officials, inspectors, and clerks constituted the first organized war ministry. Louis XIV was a vain man, but he connected his vanity to a broader political strategy to overawe the country with his own grandeur. He built himself a whole new city at the old village of Versailles, about 10 miles southwest of Paris. Where the Escorial in Spain had the atmosphere of a monastery, Versailles was a monument to worldly splendor. Tremendous in size, fitted out with polished mirrors, gleaming chandeliers, and 367 magnificent tapestries, opening onto a formal park with fountains and shaded walks, the Palace of Versailles became the marvel of Europe and the envy of lesser kings. It was virtually a public building, much of it used for government offices, with nobles, churchmen, notable bourgeois, and servants milling about on the king's affairs. The more exclusive honors of the chateau were reserved for the higher nobles. The king surrounded his daily routine of rising, eating, and going to bed, known as the liver, dîner, and coucher, with an infinite series of ceremonial acts, so minute and so formalized that there were, for example, 6 different entries of persons at the lever, and a certain gentleman at a specified moment held the right sleeve of the king's nightshirt as he took it off. The most exalted persons thought themselves the greater for thus waiting on so august a being. With such honors, and by more material favors, many great nobles were induced to live habitually at court. Here, under the royal eye, they might engage in palace intrigue, but were kept away from real political agitation in the provinces. Versailles had a debilitating effect on the French aristocracy, the splendor of Versailles. For most positions in the government, as distinguished from his personal entourage, Louis XIV preferred to use men whose upper-class status was recent. Such men, unlike hereditary nobles, could aspire to no independent political influence of their own. He never called the Estates General, which in any case no one except some of the nobility wanted. Some of the provincial estates, because of local and aristocratic pressures, were allowed to remain functioning. He temporarily destroyed the independence of the parliaments, commanding them to accept his orders as Henry IV had commanded them to accept the Edict of Nantes. He developed a strong system of administrative coordination, centering in a number of councils of state, which he attended in person, and in intendants, who represented these councils throughout the country. Councilors of state and the intendants in provincial districts were generally of bourgeois origin or newly ennobled. Each intendant within 368 his district embodied all aspects of the royal government, supervising the flow of taxes and recruiting of soldiers, keeping an eye on the local nobility, dealing with towns and guilds, controlling the more or less hereditary office holders, policing the 188 marketplaces, relieving famine, watching and often participating in the local law courts. A firm and uniform administration was superimposed upon the heterogeneous mass of the old France. In contrast to England, many local questions were handled by agents of the central government, usually honest and often efficient, but essentially bureaucrats constantly instructed by and reporting back to their superiors at Versailles. Administrative Tactics of Louis XIV, Economic and Financial Policies, Colbert. To support the reorganized and enlarged army, the panoply of Versailles, and the growing civil administration, the king needed a good deal of money. Finance was always the weak spot in the French monarchy. Methods of collecting taxes were costly and inefficient. Direct taxes passed through the hands of many intermediate officials. Indirect taxes were collected by private concessionaries called tax farmers, who made a substantial profit. The state always received far less than what French taxpayers actually paid. But the main weakness arose from an old bargain between the French crown and nobility. The king might raise taxes without consent only if he refrained from taxing the nobles. Only the unprivileged classes paid direct taxes, and these came almost to mean the peasants only, because many merchants and urban professions in one way or another also obtained exemptions. The system was outrageously unjust in throwing a heavy tax burden on the poor and helpless. Louis XIV was 189,369 willing enough to tax the nobles, but was unwilling to fall under their control. And only toward the close of his reign, under extreme stress of war, was he able, for the first time in French history, to impose direct taxes on the aristocratic elements of the population. This was a step toward equality before the law and toward sound public finance. But the nobles and wealthiest bourgeois taxpayers received numerous concessions and exemptions that greatly reduced the financial value of the reforms. Taxation. 30,000 workers were employed at one time in the building of the great royal chateau at Versailles. This 17th century image by an unknown artist shows the activity at Versailles when the king, government ministers, and nobles were assembled in the vast buildings and gardens. The grandeur and scale of these buildings were designed to symbolize the king's power and to create a sense of awe in the foreign visitors who came to meet Louis XIV or his advisors. Digital image courtesy of the Getty's Open Content program. Like his predecessors, Louis resorted to all manner of expedients to increase his revenues. He raised the tax rates, always with disappointing results. He devalued the currency. He sold patents of nobility to ambitious bourgeois. He sold government offices, judgeships, and commissions in the army and navy. For both financial and political reasons, the king used his sovereign authority to annul the town charters, then sold back reduced 370 rights at a price. This produced a little income, but demoralized local government and civic spirit. The need for money arose from the fundamental inability to tax the wealthy. This problem reflected the weakness and limitations of absolutism, because the government's refusal to share its rule with the propertied classes corrupted much of French public life and undermined the political aptitude of the French people. Louis XIV wished, if only for his own purposes, to make France economically powerful. His great finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert worked for 20 years to do so. Colbert went beyond Richelieu in the application of mercantilism, aiming to make France a self-sufficing economic unit, to expand the export of French goods, and to increase the wealth from which government income was drawn. There was not much that he could do for agriculture, the principal industry of the kingdom, which remained less developed than in England and the Netherlands. But he managed to reduce internal tariffs in a large part of central France, where he set up a tariff union oddly entitled the Five Great Farms, because the remaining tolls were collected by tax farmers. And although vested interests and provincial liberties remained too strong for him to do away with all internal tariffs, the area of the 5 Great Farms was in itself one of the largest free trade areas in Europe, being about the size of England. The 5 Great Farms. For the convenience of business, Colbert promulgated a commercial code, replacing much of the local customary law with a new model of business practice and regulation. He improved communications by building roads and canals. Working through the guilds, he required the handicraft manufacturers to produce goods of specified kind and quality, believing that foreigners, if assured of quality by the government, would purchase French products. He gave subsidies, tax exemptions, and monopolies to expand the manufacture of silks, tapestries, glassware, and woolens. 371 Colbert's Commercial Code. Colbert also helped to found colonies, built up the navy, and established the French East India Company, which soon expanded the French presence in India. During this same era, the East India Company occupied and began to develop a new Caribbean colony in Saint-Domingue, a territory on the western side of the island of Hispaniola that Spain would officially cede to France in 1697. Enslaved Africans were taken to Saint-Domingue, where they became the labor force in a colonial plantation economy that would later produce very large and profitable shipments of sugar, coffee, and indigo for European markets. Within France itself, export of some goods, notably foodstuffs, was forbidden, for the government wished to keep the populace quiet by holding down the price of bread. Export of other goods, mainly manufactures, was encouraged, partly as a means of bringing money into the country, where it could be funneled into the royal treasury. The growth of the army, and the fact that under Louis XIV, the government placed unprecedentedly 190 large orders for military uniforms, overcoats, weapons, and ammunition, greatly stimulated the employment of weavers, tailors, and gunsmiths, and advanced the commercial capitalism by which such labors were organized. Trade and manufacture thus developed in France under more direct government guidance than in England, and the French gave the English an extremely brisk competition throughout the early modern era. Not until the age of iron and coal did France begin economically to lag. 372 France from the last years of Louis XIV to the Revolution of 1789. The map gives an idea of the diversity of law and administration before the Revolution. Dark areas are pays d'états, provinces in which representative bodies, estates, continued to meet. Cities named are the seats of what the French called parliaments, CPP 181 to 182. The key indicates Colbert's tariff union, the 5 Great Farms. The area marked with hatching remained outside the French tariff system entirely. It continued to trade with the states of the Holy Roman Empire, from which it had been annexed, without interference by the French government. Numerals indicate the price of salt, i.e., the varying burden of the salt tax in various regions. In general, regions farthest from Paris enjoyed the most privileges or liberties, preserving their legal and judicial identity, provincial estates, local tariffs, and a favored position in national taxation. In general, the system elaborated in the 2 centuries of Bourbon rule, known in retrospect as the Old Regime, was a society in which groups of many kinds could connect their own special interests with those of the absolute monarchy. But it rested on a precarious inconsistency. On the one hand, the royal government, through its intendants and bureaucracy, worked to restrict the privileges of provinces, nobles, and others. On the other hand, it multiplied and protected these and other privileges in its perpetual need for money. The inconsistency was not resolved until the Revolution of 1789, when the principle of equality of rights would replace the regime of privilege. 373191, Religion. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes, 1685. The consolidation of France under Louis XIV reached its high point in his policies toward religion. For the Catholics, Louis backed the old claims of the Gallican Church to enjoy a certain national independence from Rome. He repressed the movement known as Jansenism, a kind of theological Calvinism within the Catholic Church, which remained influential for almost 2 centuries. Jansenists criticized moral laxity in high places, as well as the religious power of the Jesuits, so there was wide support at Versailles when the king moved against all the main centers of Jansenist theology. But it was the Protestants who suffered most in a new wave of religious persecutions. France, in the early years of Louis XIV's reign, still allowed more religious toleration than any other large state in Europe. The Huguenots had lost their separate political status under Richelieu, but they continued to live in relative security, protected by the Edict of Nantes of 1598. From the beginning, however, toleration had been a royal rather than a popular policy, and under Louis XIV, the royal policy changed. The fate of Catholics at the hands of a triumphant parliament in England suggests that the Protestants in France would have been no better off under more popular institutions. Bending all other institutions to his will, Louis XIV resented the presence of heretics among his subjects. He considered religious unity necessary to the strength and dignity of his rule. He fell under the influence of certain Catholic advisors who wished to turn Protestants back to Catholicism and gain greater glory for themselves. Systematic conversion of Huguenots was begun. Life for Protestant families was gradually made unbearable. Finally, they were literally dragooned, mounted infantrymen being quartered in Huguenot homes to reinforce the persuasions of missionaries. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes. During the persecutions, hundreds of thousands of Protestants left France, migrating to Holland, Germany, and America. Their loss was a severe blow to French economic life, for although Protestants were 374 found in all levels of French society, those of the commercial and industrial classes were the most mobile. With the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, France embarked on a century of official intolerance, slowly mitigated in practice, under which Protestants in France were in much the same position as Catholics in the British Isles. The fact that 100 years later, when Protestants were again tolerated, many of them were found to be both commercially prosperous and politically loyal, suggests that they actually fared far better than the Catholic Irish. Louis XIV seeks religious unity. All things considered, the reign of Louis XIV brought considerable advantages to the French middle and lower classes. His most bitter critics, with the natural exception of Protestants, were disgruntled nobles such as the Duke of Saint-Simon, who thought that he showed too many favors to persons of inferior social rank. Because Protestants were an unpopular minority, his repression of them won much approval. Colbert's system of economic regulation and perpetuation of the guilds meant that innovation and private enterprise developed less fully than in England, but France was economically stronger in 1700 than in 1650. Peasants were heavily taxed to pay for Louis XIV's wars, and they suffered through devastating famines after 1690, also caused partly by the wars. But they did not sink into the serfdom that was rising in Eastern Europe. Compared to later times, France was still a hodgepodge of competing jurisdictions, special privilege, and bureaucratic ineptitude. The king was in truth far from absolute, but France was nevertheless the best organized of the large monarchies on the continent. Louis XIV, in turning both high and low into dutiful subjects, may even have advanced the cause of abstract civil equality. For a long time, he was generally popular. What finally turned his people against him in his last years was the strain of his incessant wars. Accomplishments of Louis XIV, 37-5192. The systematic repression of French Huguenots after 1685 was widely condemned in Protestant countries. Images such as this gruesome depiction of torture contributed to the international hostility for Louis XIV and to the foreign acceptance of French refugees who scattered into Protestant states throughout Europe and North America.